All right. Well, thought I'd just check in with a couple of people. So just between us, just to raise a few ideas here. Either put your hand in the air or come in and I can let you speak, or if you've got some ideas, let's type them into the chat. So between those two areas, we can maybe just cover a few of the ideas that we need to be thinking about. Maybe I'd like to read out some of the ones that they came up with. Julia.
We all need energy. Wind farms are natural free energy, and they've been used successfully for hundreds of years with Hessian sails, and there's no contaminated waste. Whereas the cons would be they're made with plastic, they have sharp tips that maim or kill birds, they're ugly to look at, then so are pylons, and there will be contaminated waste.
Great, thank you. So heard a few things there in terms of actually just going into some of the things in terms of pros and cons of them from an environmental perspective. But you can see some of the topic areas you want to know about, how much energy it might generate compared to other possibilities I heard there, what the danger to wildlife are. So you want to know about what the actual specifics of that dangers are, rather than what you might have heard on the grapevine, whether that's true or not. Anybody else? Rob, and then Joy.
So I put down here noise, wildlife impact, tourism, and then I've got just a list of factors that could benefit the community or not. So the people that will be affected will be the community around the wind farm itself. So will it enhance their well-being by reducing pollution? Will it reduce the cost of energy to them, so they've got more disposable income? And will they get any financial benefit from it, I guess?
Absolutely, yeah. So what are the effects on the local economy? I heard coming in there as well, the personal effects on the culture in that area, and wanting to hear some facts and figures about the reality of that. What's the reality going to be if we put some up there? Thank you, Rob. Joy, any further ones to add from you?
I guess I tackle this differently. I just kind of looked at it from different categories of what sort of information would be required. So I've just got broad categories, like
Great.
Farmers would need to be consulted, and we'd need input from farmers.
Yep.
We need input from people actually living there. We probably need input from tourist industry, input from any flying, aircraft or that sort of area. You mentioned conservation, if it's a conservation area, ecology, and sort of someone who's an expert in the design and output and etc. of these the wind turbines and the disturbance that it would cause. So that's how I came at it.
Great. Yeah, exactly the kind of thing that is an example of what you need to consider if you're going to do this and really well. So you can imagine that what we're kind of doing here is a bit like with a citizens' assembly. If you're going to do a citizens' assembly, which is a very comprehensive deliberative process, which is often, many, many weeks long and well researched and all of that. The kind of things that you think you would need to be researching to put that information pack together so that whoever comes along, the random selection of representative people of the population, will have the information and be informed to be able to take in all of these things into consideration and come up with a wise answer. So that's kind of what we're thinking about here. And it's great that we're working through the thinking that it would take for us to be satisfied with a decision ourselves, but that would also satisfy other people. And then we're not going to go into this in this particular session, but you can see how then that would need to be quite comprehensive to demonstrate to somebody that it's impartial. So you're not going to impart your own bias onto it in terms of research. So how would you do checks and balances to make sure that it really was genuinely impartial and not vulnerable to attack by somebody saying, well, actually, you haven't thought about everything. you haven't taken everything into account, and you've biased the process before you've even started deliberating. So hopefully that was useful in terms of just thinking through what you might do from the very outset. And even with something relatively contained like wind farms or not, already you can see the range of different things you need to take into consideration. So things like tackling climate change, you can imagine that's so much greater. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time now just talking to you about what this particular deliberation did, and some of the, just a cherry picking a few things that was brought to that session that you may or may not have already thought of, just by way of adding to what you've already started by thinking about these different areas. So one person mentioned about community impacts, and one particular bit of input for this particular exercise, this workshop, which by the way was quite interesting because it was a role play exercise. So rather than just deliberating as a human, you might have been given a role like a Welsh farmer's role, and you'd represent their interests, or you might have been given the birds of prey role because they're going to be potentially impacted, or the peat bog role, what's the impact they're going to be. And so it was humans and non-humans, which made it really quite interesting. But one of the ones, I'm just picking a few out without going through them all, was the proposal to have community-owned wind farms. So all of the profit was pumped back into the community and kept local. So they quoted, "We take some of the money of our profits and put it back into the local community through some of the West Mill Sustainable Energy Trust, and they have insulated the village hall. They've put solar panels on the roof of a local school, and it's really a win-win all round." And that was an example from Oxfordshire. A few of you mentioned wildlife. You probably know that birds, anything flying, so actually bats, this information that for this research, for this particular project, found out that it's bats more than birds that are killed by wind turbines. I didn't know that before I read this. And bats navigate and find food in the dark using echolocation. And they send out sound waves from the mouth or nose and listen to the echoes. This tells them where objects are in space. The maximum range at which bats can echolocate is 20 meters. Turbine blades rotate at 75 meters a second, and that means that bats have only a quarter of a second to react to a blade. So there's some details there in terms of the impact it might have on a particular part of wildlife. I was going to go on to, there was loads of other information about it, so how turbines actually work, the metals that are used to create them. I know somebody was mentioning the life cycle impact of the materials, the rare earth metals that are used, the impact on future generations, and the effect on the landscape. So there's all that information was covered. And then there was also roles. So I mentioned the Welsh farmer, there was a local blacksmith. You could take on the role of the eagle, and people from way back who were on the land, they were represented. And there's one here by representing the peat. And peat was quite interesting. It's something else I didn't know either, because peat, Pete was saying, as Pete, I exist in my own right, just as you do, but I'm also useful for human beings, incredibly useful. 1.5 football pitches of me typically contain over 5,000 tons of carbon. Any disturbance, i.e. something like putting a wind turbine on peat, means that I dry out and release my carbon. This can happen for hundreds of meters around every turbine. Once I start, I find it very hard to stop. Humans tell me that wind farms may eventually emit more carbon than an equivalent coal-fired power station. Is that really such a good idea? Can't I be left in peace? So on the basis of that, you'd be thinking, yeah, right, wind turbines are great, but maybe not build them on peat because that would be counterproductive. And obviously, we're going to go on to the kind of process that you might go through personally of checking out some of these things if you wanted to get the facts clear in your own mind about any of these claims. So I'm just going to leave it there as just an example. I think we've explored this one quite a bit in terms of what you originally thought you would need to consider, and that was a wide range of things. And I've maybe given you a couple of other examples of things that you may or may not have thought of, but either way, you're aware of the fact that things need to be considered ideally before you start making decisions and deliberating on them. Okay, so I'm going to give you, I'm going to put you into pairs briefly now, and let's do a 6 minutes. And so you got 3 minutes each. You can just check in and say hello, and then just share why good input is important to you. Just as simple as that. So why is good input, in your view, really important for a deliberative session? Okay. We've got a little bit of time to hear if anybody wants to share anything. Anything you learned based on why is good input important to you? Go on, Julia.
To go out and stand on a soapbox and say, look, we need change. One has to have the facts, because otherwise one will make a stupid fool of oneself. I mean, I have to have the facts, like with masks, trying to tell my friends, you've got to have a mask, otherwise you're likely to get the infection again, more than likely. And where I live, people aren't doing that. And we've got hordes of tourists and loads of people running into each other on the streets and in the shops. So basically, I've been fighting for climate change since I was a teenager to help the environment. So having the facts is really important. Otherwise, one makes a huge fool of oneself.
Great, thanks. And Alison.
Well, it's all about it. You know, if you're having a deliberative discussion, then you have to have decent facts and information, because otherwise how can you possibly make a proper decision? So I wouldn't feel confident making a decision based on facts or information that didn't appear to make sense, wasn't really founded on good evidence. So, you know, you don't feel it invalidates the whole thing, I think, unless you have proper information to work on.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. And what I heard when you were saying that was that it also would compromise the credibility of the process that we're trying to promote as well, as it does democracy people and bringing in deliberation. If when you do it, you haven't got all the information at your fingertips, and then people will question the validity of it. Final one from Rob. Over to you.
So just a kind of clarification around who are the people providing the input. Is it, I'm aware to have credibility, you need to have all sides represented and have diversity. But what could end up happening is you could have a representative person from aviation who could be a climate change skeptic. And how do you manage that? Do you allow it in because that makes you credible and then all sides are heard, or is that just going to create some self-confirming bias among some of the participants? Great question, Rob. Yeah, I mean, we're probably not going to be able to do that and answer for that justice in this particular conversation, but you can see where that question is taking everybody, Rob. You know, Rob, you've probably planted a seed there. Well, that's a bigger one to look at. If you were doing this, I mean, just from my perspective, I guess what we're asking for, how do you know when it's impartial? Because we've all got inherent biases. And you might be concerned that you will impart your own bias on something, and that's something I've been very mindful of in the work that I've been doing. I guess the inquiry comes, the answer to that question comes from that inquiry. So how would you get legitimacy from the whole of the people if they looked at the process you've gone through? And one thing that I know that Citizens Assemblies conversations have included is, rather than just a single group of people, you have lots of groups of people all checking on each other. It's a bit like peer review in the kind of scientific paper community. So you're getting as many independent views. So these individual biases get nullified a little bit more. But really interesting question, and there's probably a lot of work to do as a culture to answer that question.
I'm going to just take one more comment and then we're going to move on. So, Jan, I can see your hand up. Apologies if I've missed anybody else out.
Just about Rob's question, I listened to a seminar on a climate jury, so not as big as a citizens' assembly, where they chose residents especially who belong to certain groups, and i.e. are representative, ethnic minorities and all this kind of thing. But they did also include, percentage-wise, this kind of group of people who are climate deniers, but they did climate change deniers. So they didn't exclude them altogether, but they didn't overload the jury with these people. But you probably had one person who was a climate change denier. So I think that's not a bad idea. To have some sort of representation. I think they wanted to include a couple more people from one category of people who are otherwise underrepresented, but they were trying to ensure some kind of vague level of proportionality and representativeness.
Right. Jan, just to clarify, I think what you're referring to there is actually the participants of an assembly. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, so that absolutely applies there too. I think what Rob was referring to is the research team. So putting together, which is kind of what we're talking about here, but absolutely the same principles apply. It's the same question. You know, if you've got, say, like, people could argue if I'm assuming a lot of you were in XR, if we are the team, then people could legitimately say we're biased. You know, so that's the sort of thing you need to consider. What does it take to get legitimacy? I just will hear from one more person because I think, Paula, you had your hand up as well and I didn't come to you. So Paula, then we'll move on.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that what people like and want to be heard. So, and I think it helps them to be more willing to change if they're actually heard. That's what I wanted to say. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So again, that is a kind of the participant process, which is absolutely where that needs to be absolutely credible as well. And what you said there, I think, is a universal truth, is that people will go along more often with a final answer or a final finding of a particular deliberation if they feel they've been heard themselves, even if it wasn't their first choice. So this is a crucial part of the actual deliberation process. Brilliant. Okay, so thanks for everything there. I think we've covered a lot of ground there in terms of hopefully thinking about the way you might start going about gathering information for any particular deliberation and the importance of doing it thoroughly. I'm going to move on now to critical thinking, which is more about the actual process within the deliberation itself, and how are you creating as a facilitator the culture of analysis, critical thinking, interrogation, not just accepting things without due process. Is that something that you do regularly yourself as an individual? How can you cultivate that culture within a group if you're in an assembly? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the basics of critical thinking, the key questions, constructing arguments, and then particularly working on common logical fallacies. So we'll spend a bit of time on that because they're the ones that you can get tripped up on as at the very beginnings of becoming a critical thinker. So again, I'm no master expert of this. I've spoken and I've listened to a few, but I'm practicing, and I think that's one of the things I said at the beginning, is that critical thinking is not something you ever could get done. You're always getting better and better and better at it. I'm reading this book at the moment. Some of you may know it, The Four Agreements, and I'll read them out. Be impeccable with your word. Don't take anything personally. Don't make assumptions, and always do your best. All of those four things, you can read about, but you're going to constantly be working on all the time, because we, for example, always make assumptions, so every day we're probably making assumptions, but practicing to notice when you're doing that. And then it's that kind of thing. Critical thinking is that it's an ongoing challenge, requires constant work to become a master. So the intention of this session is to simply raise awareness of it, the value and its importance, the the more you know about it, the more you know you don't know, and it's always important to try our best. And to know that citizens' assemblies, which is part of Exar's third demand, and the most comprehensive deliberative process that's available for making decisions, certainly at national level, they have critical thinking embedded into those processes. So if you go along to one of those, you will be taught, at least on the ones I've been aware of, critical thinking skills at the beginning. So you're equipped to do some of those things. So just to get this started, I've got a little video to kick you off. It's just a couple of minutes, 2.5 minutes long.
Critical thinking is all about asking questions. The right questions. Questions that help you assess both the meaning and the significance of claims and arguments. Building these skills and applying them in your life makes it easier for you to assess evidence, evaluate arguments, and adapt your thinking so you stay switched on and engaged in different situations. Critical thinking involves stepping back from a situation to enable you to see all the angles before making judgments or taking decisions. It means identifying the key points, analyzing the sources of information, weighing up different types of evidence, just as a judge and jury would do in a court of law, and putting it all together into your own independent, thought-through point of view. One thing that it's very important to realize is that critical thinking isn't about being critical. And it's about much more than just finding flaws in other people's claims. By itself, that isn't enough to give you an edge. To be a true critical thinker means being creative, reflective, and adaptable, evaluating the evidence to decide for yourself what is accurate, what is relevant, and do I have sufficient information to take a decision on this topic? Thinking critically means taking a stand for yourself. It can be difficult not to be swayed by close family or friends' views on things, or certain beliefs that just feel right. But learning how to use these higher-order thinking skills can help you to feel much more confident in your own opinions and conclusions. Critical thinking is also about a sense of discovery and excitement. Not only about learning, but evaluating arguments to see how they stand up, and filtering for yourself what resonates as right or wrong. By using these techniques, you'll find yourself becoming a clearer, better thinker. McCat. Learn better, think smarter, aim higher.
Okay, so you can see from that video that it's a very kind of general introduction to critical thinking and what it means. And one of the essential initial skills with critical thinking is asking some kind of key questions. And we're going to just do an exercise on those just to get our juices flowing and just to get a little bit of muscle memory, just to start the process of, rather than just accepting something, to say, hold on a minute, just before I accept that, where's that from? You know, who said that? Is that source reliable? Do you have data supporting that claim? Has it been scientifically proven? Are you qualified to speak on that topic? Or do you have a personal stake in the issue, which is quite a common one sometimes? So we're going to do an exercise. I'm going to lead you into an exercise. Again, it's going to be in pairs. It's quite quick fire, but you're going to be offering to the other person a statement, and all they've got to do is come back with a question. Okay, rather than just saying, oh yeah, I agree with that. They ask a question, and I'll give you some prompts. So I'm going to just talk you through this exercise by showing you the document I'm going to give to you, and you'll get a copy of this, and you'll go into your little breakout room with this document, and you can read it together. This is you can see there's 2 pages. The first one is person A, and the second page is for person B. So you'll decide who's A and B in your pairs, and what you can then do is just take it in turns. The first person, A, will read out a statement. So in the case of this one, the first statement to read is vaccinating children is important and reduces the risk of disease in society. And then person B will then come back with a question. And it could be any one of these that I've just read out, or you can think of one yourself. Anything just to get you questioning or asking something around that particular statement. And then once you've answered it, you then read a question, a statement for person A. So you take it in turns. You may not get through the whole list, but as long as you're going alternate, you'll each have an equal chance to respond. So remember to alternate A and B. So you each get a chance to read our question out, and then the other person gets a chance to respond, and then you then swap over and then see how many you get through. And it's just to get this kind of muscle memory going on picking what you think is the most appropriate question. In some cases, you can ask any of them or one of your own. And other ones, you might think, well, actually, that's the better question to ask there because it's particularly going to pin that person down or pin the question down. What I'll do now is I'll give you that document in the chat. So if you all grab that and then follow it, you can sometimes click it in the link and it'll just automatically open. So just make sure you've all got that before you go. Question from Joy.
Do we just have that one interchange, or do we keep the conversation going?
So there's 9 statements each, 18 altogether. So just keep going through as many as you can.
So it's not a conversation, it's just those one-liners.
Correct, yes. So you could have a little conflab, say, I'll give you some time at the end to reflect as well. I'll get a sense of when I'll probably join one of you in the room to get a sense of how long it takes. I don't know yet how long it's going to be, but I'll give you enough time to get through most of them. And then I'll give you a little message saying, maybe stop and reflect on how to do that. Any other clarifications? Great, okay. Okay, good luck everybody. Make the most of it. Anybody got anything on what they noticed by doing that exercise? Mac.
Brainstorming is good. And I think the more people that are involved in discussions, if everybody has a voice, the better the result you get, in my experience. It depends on, as you say, on the quality of input. But I'm just thinking in a professional context, I've worked as a surveyor most of my life. And when I'm talking to 1 or 2 surveyors and we're agreeing something, we never get as good a decision if you talk about 6 or 7 surveyors. There's a critical limit. If you get too many people, there's a drag on that decision-making process. But brainstorming, more people is good. That's my comment on it.
Thanks, Mac. Jackie.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I thought it was really useful in terms of understanding the right sort of questions to ask, which meant that the person saying the statement really had to think about the answer, and so it was drawing them out, and you would definitely get a feeling that people were being genuine and honest and that they knew their stuff from the questions you're asking.
Great. And did you find that there was a particular question that was more appropriate in each case, or in some cases it didn't matter?
Yeah, no, I think that mostly there were the particular questions that were appropriate for the statement. Yeah. Yeah. Although maybe many of them would have worked, it's just that you tended towards one that, yeah.
Great. Okay. So that's what I'm hearing there is that at least you've got a bit more of an arsenal of things to check in on. But what you're finding is that you're actually just, your mental processes are questioning rather than just saying, I accept everything you're saying without questioning at all. Thank you, Jackie. Joy.
I have a question. I noticed most of the questions were closed questions, not open questions. And I wondered about the rationale behind that.
Right. So by closed questions, what are you saying? Like, is that sort of reliable?
No,
Like
well,
closed
it's a
question.
yes/no answer. Whereas if it's an opener question, it's like, you know, where's that source, or where did you get that?
Right.
Then it encourages the other person to talk, whereas otherwise you get a yes/no. So I was just asking about that, because I don't know whether the purpose of this is to encourage the other person to talk more and share more, or whether it's to close it down and pinpoint.
Yeah, I think in answer to that question, I mean, this is an exercise probably artificially created to get the person who's asking the questions, who's responding to change their thinking process rather than just to accept something. They're asking themselves, maybe just to themselves, is that source reliable? And then they're asking that question genuinely together. So it's an inquiry together, maybe, but just, you know, I guess some of them could be open questions like, what is the source? Where did you get that information from? Is more of a kind of, well, there could be a wide range of answers there. Are you qualified to speak on this topic? I guess the answer is yes or no, but you're maybe asking it of yourself rather than saying, are you qualified? Which is maybe more confrontational.
Yes, because I think that's kind of where I was going with that, because if it's a close question, it can lead to more confrontation, whereas an open question draws someone and, you know, allows them to speak more and express what's going on for them.
Yeah, thanks, Joy. This is really helpful, because I think what that's saying there is that this is not, just to make this clear, this is not a strategy for engaging in conversation. I mean,
Right.
I'm not suggesting you would say, are you qualified to speak on this matter? But you might ask yourself, and you might then bring in your skills saying, okay, but, you know, what's your background? Okay, so yeah, so you're not an expert in this, but, you know, we're in this inquiry together. I wonder if there is an expert out there we could both go towards and find out definitively, without sort of accusing them of not being thorough. So it's the spirit of inquiry, I think, that you're doing together rather than having a kind of a jousting match, as it were, which sometimes these can fall into. Final comment from Rob, and then we'll move on to the next exercise. Rob.
So in my experience, people I talk to that don't believe that what we all believe in is important and critical have an emotional reaction to the environmental movement, and then they look for information to support that emotional feeling. So in a way, is our role to try and, I mean, I'm going to say teach, but obviously you wouldn't say that to them because they find that patronising, but is our way to try and sell them the idea of thinking critically because they're not?
Thanks, Rob. Yeah. Yeah, so just to be clear, that this whole process in Trust the People is more coming from the process of a facilitator. So without, I mean, in that respect, we have to be completely impartial and independent. So you're putting a facilitator hat on and you're bringing those skills. And that's probably not this workshop, but it's one of the key skills as a facilitator to demonstrate that you are impartial. And actually, my experience is most people are able to do that when you've got some of these skills in your back pocket. You know, these can sometimes help, and you can interrogate the people you might be supporting as well, saying, well, hold on a minute, are you qualified? Surely there's more people qualified than you, and let's go to them. So yeah, and of course, in Trust the People and in this whole building democracy, it isn't with a particular topic in mind, although of course, you know, if you give people skills and tools to make collective decisions, clearly the biggest topics are going to start becoming the main conversations, and climate's obviously going to be one of those. I did say we were going to move on, but I just see that a couple of people have written stack in the thingy. So Neil, we haven't heard from you yet. If you can be brief, and then I'll go to Graham as well. Neil, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. I've just put my comment in the chat, actually, so I won't take your time.
Great. So asking people to validate what they say raises the bar on using objective truths for all participants. Great. And Graham?
Yes, a lot of the points I was going to raise have already been mentioned, but just one left, I think, which is the fact that you can find evidence for anything from scientific and academic sources online. So, you know, we shouldn't depend too much on, you know, what's your source and what's your evidence, because there are, even amongst academics from different institutions or even in the same university, there are wildly different interpretations of things, and you can basically prove anything with statistics as well. depending on how you frame it. So I wonder if for this kind of conversation, I know the exercise wasn't meant to be a natural conversation, but if you are trying to convince somebody, maybe just asking them to dig deeper about their own reasons at a personal level for thinking a particular way, because a lot of people don't look at things very analytically, looking for evidence and academic sources and so on. Sometimes it's just a question of, why do you feel that way? What happened in the past that made you feel that way? And maybe when they look at that, almost from a sort of Freudian perspective, they might suddenly decide, they might have this eureka moment, oh, maybe I'm traumatized by something, or whatever it may be.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I can't see, let me just see your name. What's your name again? Because Sven's thing, Graham. Yeah, what was I going to say about that? I think the main thing is actually maybe a challenge to go away with is can you review one of your own beliefs about something and then come at it with fresh eyes, and then be willing to adjust your position. And if you can, I mean, there's going to be something like that on everything, no matter what, however well researched you are. And then you can then develop some humility for people who are in the situation where they're going to need to do that. So that's something to model and represent as a facilitator as well. I realized there was probably a few other people who wanted to talk then. Apologies. Just mindful of time. Don't want to go over, and I've got another exercise I want you to look at. So thanks for all of that input. I'm going to move on now to just a very little bit of basic input, and then we're going to watch a video of a really interesting fella talking about logical fallacies, and then I've got an exercise for you all to do on that. Will help you explore these a little bit more fully. But so, again, I said I've done a few little bits and courses in critical thinking, so not an expert, but a practicing person. And one of the basic aspects of critical thinking that you'll be taught if you did a course on this was the whole idea of constructing an argument and making a conclusion as robustly defendable as possible. And generally what you'll start off with a series, one or more premises, so which are facts or assertions which are demonstrably true, which you then build up from to make a new conclusion. And clearly those premises need to be as well founded as possible, otherwise your argument is groundless. So that's some term you might hear a lot of. What are your premises? And then you might bring those together into some kind of logical conclusion. And if that's logically robust, then that will add to the weight of your particular argument. And there's just one other thing that I thought was a really fundamental, valuable principle to follow in critical thinking. And this is this generosity principle of generosity, so that when you go into a conversation with somebody, to see it as a collaborative conversation and not one where you're trying to beat the other person. And what the generosity principle is that you help the other person make their best possible argument, so that if you can then beat it, it's not quite the right word, but if you can then demonstrate that yours is more robust, then you've got a even more logically sound and robust argument. What you don't want to do is to beat a weak argument, because then it doesn't really mean that you've actually demonstrated yours is that much better. So always help your opponent to construct their best possible argument and then beat it. So the aim is not to win, but to reach the wisest answer between you as a collaborative force. So it's a bit like the principle of the adversary principle. You get the best out of each other. So they also talk a lot about logic and having a logical conclusion. So this happened, and therefore this is inevitable. So there's some kind of logic in there. And there can be some formal mistakes, formal fallacies regarding logic, which is just basic logic has fallen down. But the more common ones that trip us up in terms of arguments are what's known as informal ones. So there's some kind of flaw in the context of an argument. And we're going to do some exploration into these right now. So just verbally, there's a few that you might be familiar with. Things like the false dilemma. You're giving people just two options and asserting that that's the only two. And there could be, of course, lots more. This correlation does not prove causation is a common one, as is cherry picking. So if you've got a particular position on something, you might cherry pick evidence that support just that claim and ignore everything else. And of course, that's not balanced at all, but it's quite common that if you have a particular position. Another one you'll see a lot in politics is what they call ad hominem, which is where instead of attacking the argument, the thing that somebody's saying, you attack them as a person. And you say, they're not credible. Don't listen to him. He wears blue trousers. You know, you can't possibly listen to what he's saying. Some completely irrelevant aspect about them. And this is very common. And of course, you just don't talk about the actual thing they're saying at all. And then another very common one is straw man, where you or your opponent will misrepresent you in some way, and the video will cover that one as well. So I personally find that these are really fascinating, and they're also a minefield. I'm doing them all over the place, and you'll see these on the telly, you'll see these all over the place, and it's quite a bit to unpick them and to spot the happening right there and then. But we're going to just start a process of exploring this so that you get a sense of, I wonder if that's that. And then you can then come in with a question that challenges it, and you don't get beaten by a false argument. One thing I heard earlier, just some definitions that are often misused, especially with the climate change, is this whole idea of a skeptic. Now, a skeptic is a great thing, because in the context of critical thinking, you're questioning everything. And that's a good thing. A skeptic is a good thing. I think when we say climate change skeptic, what we mean is a climate change denier. They're not skeptic, they're denying the truth of it, or they could be a denier of something else. So in the context of critical thinking, a skeptic is actually a really good thing. So just be mindful that we should all be skeptical about things, but equally so on all claims, not just cherry picking the ones that we agree with. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to finish. The last exercise of the evening is going to be a little practice session on identifying logical fallacies. And got this it's just a really fun video, actually. It's a guy from Edinburgh University called Richard Milne. And I'm going to play you this. It's about 8 minutes long. And he talks about certain logical fallacies. And he gives you an example. He talks about climate change, but he gives you an example also in terms of the Titanic, the sinking of the Titanic. So he gives you a couple of examples of each one for the Titanic and one for climate change. And then we're going to try and recreate that exercise I think we'll do this in threes, this one. So you can work together to work out which one each one is. Okay, so strap in, I'll play this video. And then we'll have a conversation about it, exercise. All right. Let's hope this works. It will do. Share.
Hello, my name is Dr. Richard Milne, and this is the introduction to the second climate change exercise. Now, on screen, we have a list of 10 commonly used tactics for deceiving the audience in the media, misrepresenting science in various ways, and in particular climate science. So I'm going to give you an example of each one, and we'll start off with the most blatant one, which is the lie. So this is where a statement is wholly or partially inaccurate. So, for example, climate change is a hoax, carbon dioxide doesn't cause warming. Those are both hoaxes, they are both themselves lies. So for each of these, I've got an analogy of a guy on the Titanic trying to convince everyone the ship is never going to sink. So he might be saying, the ship can't sink, or there's no such thing as icebergs. Okay, moving on to our second example. This is the half-truth. Now, a half-truth is where a statement is made that, while accurate, leaves out such important information as to be deceptive. In climate change, for example, the climate's changed before. That's a half-truth, because if you don't know the details, it makes it sound like all climate change is natural, which it absolutely certainly is not. The equivalent of a man on the Titanic saying, well, the ship can steer, so that will allow us to avoid icebergs, when the reality is it can only steer so far, and the faster the ship is going, the less it can steer to avoid icebergs. Number 3 is completely true, but irrelevant. It's like saying basically something that's completely accurate, nothing wrong with it, but when presented out of context, it can appear to be a challenge to the science when it isn't. Like, carbon dioxide is plant food. Yes, it is, but does that make any difference to its role in global warming? No, it doesn't. So this is like someone on the Titanic saying, well, no ship this size has ever been sunk by an iceberg before, which is true, obviously, because there hadn't been any ships that size before. Right, number 4 is confusing science with politics. This is making a political statement and then dressing it up as a challenge to the science. So, Kyoto hasn't worked, wind farms are too expensive, carbon tax is too unpopular. Those things may or may not be true, but none of them are any challenge whatsoever to the science of what's causing climate change. So when we're talking about the Titanic, you might be saying, well, if we don't go at full speed, we'll be late arriving in New York, so we should assume icebergs don't exist. So it's a political statement, we should be going faster, which dresses up a sort of an opposition to the science of icebergs existing and being a problem. Right, number 5 is confusing belief of the public with evidence. Sometimes you'll hear someone saying, well, the public belief in climate change is falling away. People don't believe this stuff anymore. Well, science isn't like that. Things either are or they're not, whether people believe them or not. The Earth did not suddenly become round in the last 2,000 years just because people started believing it. It's always been round. Climate change will happen whether we believe in it or not. So we move on to number 6, which is misdirection. Now this is, oh, look, over there, Mars is warming. Oh, look at these naughty scientists. Look at these emails they've stolen. Look what they're saying to each other. It's distracting the attentions of your audience away from the hard evidence. And if the evidence for something is very, very convincing, then your best hope of stopping people believing it is to make them look elsewhere. This is how magicians work. It's how pickpockets work. Now, if your man on the Titanic is trying to ensure that the ship crashes into an iceberg, then as the iceberg appears, he'll say, oh, look, dolphins! Everyone look at the dolphins! So that's the sort of thing. Number 7 is cherry picking. This is a very common tactic of misrepresenting the evidence. So you choose your evidence very, very carefully and you make it look as if the trend is the opposite of what it really is. So I might say, oh, England beat Brazil 2-0 in a football match in 1984. Therefore, England are a better team than Brazil. And you probably all know, whichever country you're in, that that's total nonsense. In the terms of climate change, you might say 2006 was warmer than 1998. Therefore, the world is cooling, which again is nonsense. Those 2 years have been cherry-picked. On the Titanic, our friend might be standing on the back of the ship as it's tipping up, and he's saying, well, this part of the ship is going higher, not lower. Therefore, the ship isn't sinking, it's taking off. Okay, 3 more to go. Number 8 is what I call promoting the maverick. Now, in science, you always have, well, you often have, when the evidence is really, really strong, a consensus. Most scientists believing a theory because the evidence points that way. But there will always be 1 or 2 who, no matter what the evidence say, no, I don't believe the consensus, I believe this. And actually, that's healthy. That's how science works. And very, very rarely one of these mavericks is right. Where the problem comes is when the media takes the opinion of one single maverick and treats it as being superior to that of all these thousands of scientists who believe what the evidence currently says. And so this becomes a deception, and not always through the fault of the maverick themselves. Number 9 is the false expert. This is where someone without any expertise in climate change is presented as an authority on the subject. It might be a chemist or an astrophysicist or a geologist. It might be an art historian. Very often it's a politician, an economist, or the member of the board of an oil company. And these people are trotted out in right-wing press or wherever, and their views on climate change are treated as being gospel. This is like somebody on the Titanic saying, look, I found this guy here, he works in the engine room and he says the ship's unsinkable, ignore everyone else, listen to him. Finally, we have the straw man attacking the actual theory of the science or attacking the people it comes from by misrepresenting them. So you might just say it's activists who say the planet is warming, it's environmentalists who say CO2 is warming the planet. That's a falsehood because it is scientists who are saying these things. Environmentalists are saying, do something about it, man. But that's the political side. The scientific side is carbon dioxide is warming the planet. Also, you can have a misrepresentation of the theory itself. So saying that, well, scientists say the sea level is rising because sea ice is melting. When in fact, when ice on water melts, it doesn't change the volume. True, that's why scientists are not saying that's what's rising sea levels. Sea levels are rising because the ice on land is melting and because of the thermal expansion of water. So our friend on the Titanic might say, well, they say icebergs can sink ships because they move around at 30 miles an hour, but I know for a fact that they move very slowly. Clearly, no one is saying icebergs move at 30 miles an hour. He's misrepresenting the opposing argument. Or he might say, who is it that says this ship is sinking? Lifeboat manufacturers, that's who. And again, misrepresentation. Okay, those are the 10 forms of deception, and I've given you a list of claims that have appeared in the press, and what you're asked to do is...
Okay. Great. All right, so that's the input, and we're going to just do an exercise immediately off the back of that, which is hopefully going to replicate some of those. So before I give you the link, again, it's the same thing. You're going to have a document to look at. I'll just show you what it looks like, and I will tell you how to use it in your particular group. We'll do this in groups of 3, I think. Let me just share this. Bear with me a second. I think it's that one. So you'll all get one of these, and you can see after the first page, there's the second page. Every page is the same, and you have to go to the page that is your group. So remember which group you're in, because if you don't pick the right one, you'll be writing in somebody else's answers, and they're all in the same one. So that's group 1, and this is group 2. So scroll down to the group that you're in, and you'll know the group because it'll tell you when you're launching into the group which room you're going to go into. So you look at the number, but it's also at the top of the room as well. So you'll get a reminder. But hopefully between the 3 of you, you'll remember. And what you've got here is a table, and each of the fallacies descriptions are in there. So lie, half-truth, true but irrelevant, and so on. And all you need to do is to type in the letter that corresponds to the Titanic analogy and the climate change analogy. And so the Titanic analogies are on the top. So you'll write in A, B, or C, whatever it is, in the first box. Look at those dolphins, which one's that? You put it in the right box, and then go to the next one. And then once you've done the Titanic ones, you go down and do the same thing for the climate change ones. So between you, you should be able to fill this in reasonably quickly, but take the time it needs to just understand why each one's going in each box. So if you don't quite get it, then just say, pause, hold on a second, why is that the right answer? And then you understand it. So the idea is obviously you get the hang of this. So take the time it needs to do that. Okay, so let me just stop sharing that. And I'll just nip in the chat just to make sure there's nothing major. I will have a look at that while you're meeting. No, okay, so you're all ready to go. All right, and I'll see when you're finished because I can see all the A's and B's going in. And if you finish early, just have a chat about it and learn a bit more. See you soon. Around in those, I noticed most people have done at least pretty much the first column. Yeah, well, what I can do, obviously you've got the link to that, so you can go back to it and have a look. And what I'll also do is post the link to the answers as well. There are lots and lots of videos on logical fallacies on YouTube. So if you just type in any of the logical fallacies, you'll find a couple of 2 or 3 minute videos on all of them.
It's just something I noticed about the process. It's very Socratic. I was just thinking, it was a bit like sort of reading what Plato said about what Socrates did. It's this thing about leading people out, looking at what they're talking about, and asking them the questions that make them think through the gaps in what they're doing. And the whole process here, in terms of critical thinking, is really that, isn't it? It's an observation, really.
Thanks, Mac. Look, I'm very conscious that it's 9, and I'm happy to stay behind and actually have final questions and comments. But I wanted to just wrap up with those people who do need to go. Apologies, the timing there didn't quite squeeze in that last exercise, but you did most of it, and hopefully you got a chance. So the answers are on this document now, which I'll share. So if you want to grab that one, you can do. And actually, no, that's the exercise again. No, that's right. That's the answers. The other thing I wanted to share to finish up is just to say, what we're doing a lot today, we've been focusing on the critical thinking as the process within a deliberation. So that's where the facilitator has to do the work. So you're bringing this quality to that deliberation, to that gathering. And generally my experience is people love it, and they if you create those boundaries, say, look, this is how we're going to operate. It's okay to challenge, it's okay to question, and you create that culture of collaborative inquiry. It makes it a lot open and much more effective in terms of getting wise answers. So something to set up as the facilitator, not to feel like you have to be a master, just to create the space for this culture to be present, and then that collective inquiry vibe permeates the entire session, which is a really great thing to cultivate. If you want to, it's always good to just reflect once you've gone from here on what the next first small step might be off the back of what you've learned tonight. That could be just going off and looking at a few more videos on logical fallacies. It might be bringing in some critical thinking, or to work out how you might create some input for a deliberative session in your local community. So something to think about there as well. And if you want to carry on the conversation, we've got a Lumio platform, so I'll just give you the link to that. That's in there, and go on there and post a question and say anything about critical thinking or input, and we can share the wisdom around our group as well. All right, that's it, guys. Thanks ever so much for coming, giving your evening up to more qualities of great deliberative processes. It's an amazing inquiry, and when you get a lot of people together and they really kind of work together and come up with a really great wise answer, that's an amazing experience for the facilitator as well as the participants. So time to get excited about the possibilities, chaps. So and thank you, everybody. So you're free to go. If anybody has any questions or comments, I'm happy to stick around for 10 minutes or so and answer those as best as I can. But for the rest of you, thank you and good night.